The day Harvey Bristol walked back into Caldwell, Kansas, the whole town went quiet as a held breath, and Charlotte Redmond stood at the door of her mercantile with flour on her hands and her heart somewhere up near her throat. It was the autumn of 1883, and the high plains were burning gold and amber in every direction you cared to look. The Santa Fe Railway had brought prosperity and noise and strangers through Caldwell all that season, and the town had grown considerably since the lean years of the late 70s. There was a new hotel now, a proper doctor's office, 2 competing newspapers, and enough saloons to keep a traveling preacher busy condemning for a week. But none of that noise, none of that bustle, none of that modern-feeling energy prepared anyone for the sight of Harvey Bristol coming down off the Flint Hills on a gray horse with mountain mud still caked to his boots. Charlotte saw him first because she was always the first to see things in Caldwell. She ran the largest mercantile on the main street, and her wide front window gave her the clearest view of anyone approaching from the North Road. She had a habit of glancing up from whatever she was measuring or wrapping or counting whenever she heard hooves, not because she was a nosy woman by nature, but because a woman alone in business learned quickly that watching was a survival skill. She recognized him despite the 7 years and the wild beard, and the fact that he was broader across the shoulders than she remembered. She recognized the way he sat a horse, easy and upright at once, like a man who had grown so comfortable in the saddle that it was simply another way of standing. She recognized the gray horse, which was impossible because that gray would have to be near 20 years old by now, except that when he drew closer she could see it was a different gray, a younger horse with the same pale coloring. He had chosen the same kind of animal. That detail undid her in a way she could not entirely explain. People came out of shops. They always did when something unusual happened in a small town, and Harvey Bristol riding in after 7 years of voluntary isolation was about as unusual as things got in Caldwell. Old Pete Dunmore, who ran the livery, squinted from under the brim of his hat. Marlene Acker, who taught at the schoolhouse 3 blocks over, pressed a hand over her mouth. 2 cowhands leaning against the post outside the saloon straightened up, each of them sensing without being told that something significant was occurring. Harvey did not look left or right with any real interest until he was nearly to the center of the main street. Then he pulled his horse to a stop and looked directly at Charlotte's mercantile, and Charlotte, who had been standing in her doorway all along, felt the full weight of those gray eyes settle on her like a hand placed gently and deliberately on her shoulder. She did not wave. She did not smile. She was not sure she was breathing correctly. Harvey Bristol dismounted, tied his horse to the post in front of her shop, stepped up onto the plank walkway and removed his hat. He said, "Charlotte." She said, "Harvey." And that was the whole of the first conversation after 7 years, but it was spoken in a way that carried all the weight of a much longer exchange, the kind of weight that words accumulate when they are held back too long. Charlotte turned and went inside her shop, because her knees were not entirely reliable at that moment, and she needed the counter between herself and whatever this was. Harvey followed her in after a pause, the door closing softly behind him and cutting off the sound of the gathering onlookers outside who were already beginning to talk. The mercantile smelled the way good mercantiles always smelled in that era, of dried herbs and cotton cloth and gun oil and penny candy, and the faint sweet rot of apples kept too long in the barrel. Charlotte went around the back of her wide counter and gripped its edge with both flour-dusted hands and looked at the man who had once been her closest friend, the man who had left before she could tell him anything important, the man whose absence had carved a specific and persistent hollow in her chest for the better part of a decade. "You look like a mountain," she said. It was the first honest thing she could find. He looked down at himself with a kind of slow assessment, as if seeing his own coat and boots and general condition through her eyes. "Suppose I do," he said. 7 years will do that to a man." 7 years, she repeated, and there was more inside those 2 words than she intended to let out. Harvey turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation, a habit she remembered from the old days when he was working something out. He had been 29 when he went up into the Flint Hills. He was 36 now, and it showed not in diminishment but in depth, in the settled heaviness of a man who had been alone with himself long enough to become fully himself. "I heard about your husband," he said. "I'm sorry." Charlotte's grip on the counter loosened slightly. Thomas Redmond had died 2 years ago, a fever that had come on fast and burned through him in 8 days. It had been a kind marriage, a practical one, entered into by 2 sensible people who got on well and needed each other for reasonable reasons. She had grieved him genuinely. But grief came in many shapes, and Harvey Bristol was not wrong to mention it, even if the timing felt slightly tilted. "Who told you?" she asked. "Came through Dodge last month," he said. "Ran into Carl Wentz. He mentioned it." Carl Wentz had a mouth like a broken fence gate. Charlotte had always known this about him. "And that's what brought you down," she said, and she meant it as a statement, but it came out sounding dangerously like a question. Harvey looked at her steadily. "Partly," he said. The bell above the shop door jangled and Mrs. Acker came in, clutching a list and pretending very hard that she had simply run out of baking soda at an extremely convenient moment. Charlotte served her with brisk efficiency, and Harvey stood back near the wall of shelving where she kept bolts of fabric, and the 2 of them waited out Mrs. Acker's careful loitering. The schoolteacher left eventually, though it was clear she had gotten everything she came for, which was the story of Harvey Bristol standing in Charlotte Redmond's mercantile. By the time the door closed again, the spell of those first few minutes had shifted into something more ordinary, which was perhaps a mercy. Charlotte measured out some coffee from the tin she kept behind the counter, made it on the small iron stove she used to heat the shop in cold weather, and set 2 cups on the counter without asking whether Harvey wanted any. He took the cup without comment, the way a man takes something he has been quietly wanting for a long time. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the honest one." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "You could have come down before now. I know Carl Wentz wasn't the only one to send word up into those hills over the years." Harvey wrapped both hands around his cup. His hands were enormous, scarred in the small ways of a man who worked with them constantly, the knuckles roughened, a long-heeled cut running along the back of the right one. "I know it," he said. "Then why now?" she asked. The question came out quieter than she intended, and it sat between them in the warm, coffee-scented air like something breakable. Harvey looked at the cup. He looked at the window where the afternoon light was coming in at an angle and laying a stripe of gold across the floorboards. He looked at Charlotte, and his face did a complicated thing that she had always loved about him, this ability to be entirely transparent about the fact that he was feeling something significant without being able or willing to say exactly what it was. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I needed to do it in person." Charlotte set her cup down carefully. "All right," she said. He took a breath. "Before I went up there, before all of it, I should have said something to you. And I didn't because I was the biggest kind of fool a man can be, which is the kind that knows exactly what he wants and runs the other direction from it." The shop was very quiet. Outside, the town went on being the town, horses and boot heels and somewhere a dog barking, but in here it was just the 2 of them and the truth finally arriving after a very long delay. "Harvey," she said. "Let me finish," he said. "Please, I've been working on this for a while." She pressed her lips together and nodded. "I went up into those hills because I thought I could get right with myself up there, get clean of everything that was pulling at me, and in some ways I did. I learned to live quieter and straighter than I ever had in town, but I also carried something up there with me that I couldn't get rid of no matter how high I climbed or how long I stayed, and that was the knowing of what I'd left behind without saying what I should have said." He put the cup down. His jaw worked. "Charlotte Redmond, I have been in love with you since the summer of 1873, which was a full 4 years before you married Thomas, and I was too much of a coward to tell you, And I left rather than watch you live a life I might have changed if I'd had the spine to open my mouth." The silence that followed this was the loudest silence Charlotte Redmond had ever stood inside. She was 34 years old. She had married at 22, been widowed at 32, and spent the intervening years building something solid and her own in a town that had not always made it easy for a woman to do so. She had grown accustomed to her own company. She had believed, if she was honest, that the particular kind of feeling Harvey was describing was something she had mostly put away in a box on a high shelf somewhere. The feeling she'd had for him before Thomas, the one that had never quite announced itself clearly enough for her to act on, partly because Harvey had been so carefully and consistently unavailable in every emotional sense, and partly because she was a practical woman who did not chase what didn't stay still. "You loved me," she said. Not a question, not an accusation, just the shape of it aloud. "Yes," he said, "and you didn't say so. No, and then you left." "Yes." She picked her cup back up, took a slow sip of coffee, set it back down. "Harvey Bristol," she said, "you are without question the most aggravating man I have ever had the misfortune to develop feelings for." The room went very still. Harvey looked at her with something that was not yet hope but was the country just next to hope, the one that borders it to the east. "Feelings," he said carefully. "Don't push your luck," she said, but she was fighting a smile and losing, and they both knew it. He stayed. That was the first thing he did, the foundational decision from which everything else followed. He took a room at the new hotel, because Charlotte was not the kind of woman who would allow him to read anything improper into his presence in town, and because Harvey Bristol, whatever else you might say about him, understood the value of doing things correctly. He paid his bill at the hotel in advance for 2 weeks, which was itself a kind of statement, and he spent the first few days in town reacquainting himself with civilization in ways both small and large. He was not entirely comfortable with the crowds. 7 years of solitude had rewired something in him, made him sensitive to noise and bodies and the constant negotiation of shared space. The mercantile was tolerable because it was Charlotte's space and had her calm order in it. The hotel dining room was harder. The saloon he avoided altogether. He walked the perimeter of the town each morning at first light, which the early risers noticed and remarked upon, and he spent considerable time at the livery talking with old Pete Dunmore about the gray horse, which Pete declared a fine specimen, and Harvey seemed quietly proud of. Charlotte watched all of this with the particular attention she gave to things she was genuinely interested in, but wanted to appear merely curious about. She watched him navigate the hardware store and exchange a few words with Miller Graves, who ran it. She watched him stand in the street one morning and simply look up at the enormous Kansas sky with an expression of a man who had forgotten how wide open things could be at ground level. She watched him stop and tip his hat to old Mrs. Beauchamp, who was 91 years old and had been in Caldwell since before there was much of anything here, and who squinted up at him and said, "You're the Bristol boy." And Harvey said, "Yes, ma'am." And she patted his arm and said, "About time." On the 4th day, he came into the mercantile in the morning before she had other customers, and he leaned his elbows on her counter, and she leaned her elbows on her side of it, and they talked for 2 hours. Not about the important things, not yet, but about the years between, in fragments and pieces, the way you have to approach something large by walking around its edges first. He told her about the cabin he had built in the hills, about the way he had learned to track deer and smoke venison, about the winter of 1879, which had been brutal and nearly ended badly, about the trappers he encountered occasionally who were good men on the whole if a little eccentric, about the way a man's mind changes when it has only itself for company, how it becomes quieter but also louder in different ways, how you end up having conversations with yourself that you should have had with other people years before. Charlotte told him about Thomas, plainly and without apology, because she had nothing to apologize for. She told him that Thomas Redmond had been a decent man who worked hard and laughed easily, and deserved the grief she gave him when he died. She told him about building the mercantile from a smaller, failing shop she had purchased with her own savings at 26, which had scandalized some people in town and delighted others. She told him about the injustice of it, how the bank had initially refused to loan money to a woman without a male cosigner, how she had walked straight to Thomas and asked him to cosign not because she loved him yet, but because she needed a practical partner and thought he might be one, and how that transaction had grown into genuine affection. She told this without bitterness, because she had metabolized the bitterness long ago, but also without pretending it hadn't been unfair, because it had been, and she was not in the habit of softening inconvenient truths. Harvey listened to all of this with the quality of attention that men rarely gave, the kind that was complete and patient and didn't jump ahead to prepare a response. When she finished, he said, "You built something real here, Charlotte. Most people don't manage that. Most people don't have to fight for the right to try," she said. "No," he agreed. "They don't." It was that quality in him, that simple, direct acknowledgement of unfair things, that she had always valued about Harvey Bristol, even in the old days. He was not the kind of man who explained away or minimized. He saw things plainly and said so. On the 6th day, he asked her to dinner at the hotel's dining room. She said yes, which she had known she would, and which he had perhaps known too. They ate roasted beef and potatoes and drank coffee, because Charlotte did not drink spirits and Harvey had given it up in the hills when he found that a man alone with whiskey tended to develop a complicated relationship with it. They talked through the meal and an hour after it, sitting at the corner table while the dining room emptied around them and the kitchen staff exchanged meaningful glances. Charlotte wore a dark blue dress that she had made herself, because she had always been a practical seamstress, and Harvey wore the best shirt he owned, which was clean and collared, and showed that he had made an effort even if it also showed that he had been living outside civilization for an extended period. He told her more about the hills. He told her about a specific morning in the spring of 1880, when the green had come back into the world all at once after a terrible winter, and he had stood outside his cabin and felt something so close to grief that he couldn't distinguish it, and had only later understood that it was loneliness arriving fully formed after a year and a half of refusing to feel it. "I thought about you that morning," he said. It was simple and direct and cost him something to say. Charlotte looked at her coffee cup. "I thought about you too," she said. "Most mornings, if I'm honest, not with bitterness, just a kind of wondering." "What did you wonder?" "Whether you were all right up there," she said. "Whether you were eating enough. Whether you were warm in winter." She paused. "Whether you miss me even a little." "More than a little," he said quietly. Outside, the last light of the autumn evening was going from amber to dark, and the oil lamps in the dining room were doing their warm, steady work, and Charlotte Redmond looked at Harvey Bristol across the table and thought that she was tired, in the most fundamental way, of building walls around things that deserved to be let out into the air. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I'm not the same woman I was at 25. I've built a life that belongs entirely to me, and I'm not interested in handing pieces of it to someone who might disappear again." "I understand that," he said. "I don't want promises you make easily," she said. "I want to see what you do, not just what you say." "That's fair," he said. "And I am not going to pretend I don't feel what I feel," she said, "because I have done that for long enough and it was a waste of everyone's time." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and the warmth in them was a thing she could feel from 3 feet away. "What do you feel?" he asked. She met his gaze squarely. "Like an idiot," she said. "An absolutely besotted idiot, which is inconvenient." He laughed at that, a real laugh, the first one she'd heard from him since he came back, and it was the same laugh, low and surprised and genuine, and something in Charlotte's chest did a thing she hadn't felt in a very long time. The following days fell into a pattern that felt both new and as old and comfortable as a well-worn boot. Harvey began spending mornings at the livery with Pete Dunmore, who it turned out needed considerable help with the place, because Pete's arthritis had advanced to the point where the more physical work was beyond him. Harvey fixed fences and moved hay and reshod horses with the efficient sureness of a man who had done all manner of physical labor alone for 7 years, and found working alongside another person surprisingly satisfying. Pete paid him a small wage, and Harvey accepted it with dignity and spent part of it on decent food, which he ate regularly because he was someone who, when left entirely to himself, forgot to. He stopped in at the mercantile each afternoon, sometimes to buy something he legitimately needed, sometimes under thin pretexts that Charlotte saw through but appreciated for the thought behind them. He bought a pound of flour once, which a man living at a hotel had absolutely no use for, and she put it in a bag for him without comment and charged him the fair price. On his way out, he said he was going to figure out how to use a hotel room stove, and she said that he absolutely was not going to do any such thing on hotel property, and there was a whole conversation in those few words that neither of them had quite got to yet. It was on a Saturday afternoon, 11 days after his arrival, that the situation in Caldwell complicated itself in the way that small western towns in 1883 occasionally did, which was to say loudly and with strangers involved. 3 riders came in from the south on that Saturday, the direction of Indian Territory, and they were of a particular type that anyone with experience could read from a distance. Hard men on hard-ridden horses, carrying more iron than they needed for honest work, and wearing the kind of expressions that suggested they were accustomed to taking what they wanted and dealing with the consequences afterward, or more accurately, ensuring there were no consequences afterward. Charlotte knew the type. You ran a mercantile long enough in a border town, and you learned to read the room before it became a room worth worrying about. She watched the 3 men from her window as they stopped first at the saloon and then, 2 hours later, rode slowly up the street with the purposeful leisure of men doing reconnaissance. Harvey was at the livery when they came, which meant he did not see what Charlotte saw, which was the lead rider stopping directly in front of her shop and studying it with a kind of interested calculation before moving on. The lead rider's name, she would learn later, was Cord Delman, and he had been wanted in 3 territories for a range of crimes that began with robbery and progressed from there. He was a large man with a red beard and pale eyes, and he had a reputation that preceded him through the cattle country like weather coming in. That evening, Charlotte told Harvey about the men over supper at the hotel. She told it plainly, without dramatizing it, because she was not a woman given to exaggeration, but also without minimizing it, because she believed in the honest assessment of risk. Harvey listened with his jaw set and a particular stillness that she recognized as attention of the highest order. "Cord Delman," he said when she was done. "I've heard the name. The marshal should know," she said, "if he doesn't already." Marshal Ben Pickett was a competent man, neither brilliant nor foolish, which Charlotte had always thought was the best you could ask for in a town marshal. She went to him herself the next morning because she was not the kind of woman who waited for things to be handled on her behalf, and she gave him what she had seen in precise and useful detail. Pickett thanked her, said he was already aware of Delman's presence and had advised him to move along, and that he expected he would be gone by nightfall. He was not gone by nightfall. He was still there the next morning and the morning after that, and on the 3rd morning he came into Charlotte's mercantile. Harvey was there. He had developed the habit of being there in the mornings, which Charlotte had not discouraged, and he was lifting a crate of canned goods from near the door to the back shelves when Delman came in with one of his men, and the particular proprietary attitude that some men carried into rooms they had no right to. Delman looked around the shop with the methodical appreciation of a man pricing things. He looked at Charlotte behind the counter. He looked at Harvey near the back shelves, who had set the crate down quietly and was now standing in a way that was quite still and quite attentive. "Morning," Delman said to Charlotte, ignoring Harvey with the specific pointedness of a man who wanted you to know he was ignoring you. "Good morning," Charlotte said, Her voice was entirely level. "Nice place you got here," Delman said. He moved along the counter, trailing his fingers over things. The second man had stayed near the door. "Woman running a store on her own, that's something." "I'm not on my own," Charlotte said. Delman glanced back at Harvey. Harvey met his eyes and said nothing, but there was something in the quality of his not saying anything that had a considerable amount of weight to it. "We're looking to resupply," Delman said to Charlotte. "Ammunition, mostly. And some dry goods." "I sell ammunition," Charlotte said, "and I set my own terms for who I sell to. Today my terms don't suit your business. I'd ask you to move along." Delman's pale eyes sharpened. The room held its breath. Harvey had moved quietly to a position that was not particularly dramatic but was very much between Delman and Charlotte, and he said, in a voice that was conversational in tone and entirely unmistakable in meaning, "The lady's made her position clear." What followed was a long, measuring moment. Cord Delman was not a stupid man, whatever else he was, and the calculation he ran in that moment was a practical one. Harvey Bristol stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his boots, had the build of a man who had spent 7 years doing physical labor alone in the wilderness, and had the particular quality of someone who had nothing in this room to lose except the woman behind the counter, which meant he had everything in the room to fight for. Delman had a reputation. Harvey had something more immediate, which was presence, complete and unmovable. Delman tipped his hat to Charlotte with a narrow smile. "We'll take our business elsewhere," he said, and he left. Charlotte did not release the breath she had been holding until the door closed, and then the next breath came out shaky in a way she was not proud of and couldn't help. Harvey turned around. He looked at her with an expression that was partly concern and partly something fiercer, the face of a man who had just come very close to something he was not willing to allow. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, then because it was true, "I've handled worse than that before." "I know you have," he said. "That doesn't mean I'm not going to stand there when I can." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said softly. Marshal Pickett had Delman and his men ridden out of Caldwell by sundown that same day, with a deputy escort to the county line, and a clear message about the consequences of return. It was handled without violence, which was the best possible outcome, and Charlotte had the satisfaction of knowing that her early warning had given Pickett the advantage of preparation. That evening, Harvey sat on the edge of the plank walkway outside the mercantile after she locked up, and Charlotte sat beside him, and they looked at the main street of Caldwell settling into its nighttime rhythms, the saloon noise and the lantern light, and the distant sound of someone playing a badly tuned fiddle somewhere. "I was scared today," Charlotte said. She said it without apology because she believed fear was a reasonable and honest response to a threatening situation, and denying it seemed pointless. "So was I," Harvey said. She looked at him. "Of what?" He looked at the street for a moment. "Of something happening to you," he said. "Of being in a world where you were not in it." He paused. "I've been afraid of that in abstract for 7 years. That was the first time I felt it in the specific and actual, and I would very much prefer not to feel it again." Charlotte felt the warmth of that settle into her bones. She leaned slightly and rested her shoulder against his, and he was solid and warm and present in a way that felt like something she had been missing the specific shape of without being able to name it. They sat like that for a while without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. His 2-week hotel bill came due, and he paid for another 2 weeks. Charlotte pretended not to notice this, but she absolutely noticed it. The town was not unaware of the developing situation between the returned mountain man and the widowed shopkeeper. Caldwell in 1883 had the usual complement of interested parties when it came to the romantic entanglements of its members. Mrs. Acker told Mrs. Beauchamp, who told half the quilting circle, who told their husbands, who told each other at the barber shop and the feed store. Opinion was divided in the specific way that small-town opinion always divides, along lines of both genuine affection for the parties involved and the particular human delight in having something interesting to discuss. The favorable camp, which was the larger camp, thought that Charlotte Redmond deserved happiness and that Harvey Bristol had clearly come back with serious intentions and that it was about time. This camp was led by Pete Dunmore, who had developed a strong personal appreciation for Harvey's work ethic and general character, and by old Mrs. Beauchamp, who had in her 91 years seen enough of life to be a firm proponent of people telling each other the truth before it was too late. The skeptical camp was smaller and somewhat sour, led mainly by a man named Gerald Holt, who had made a few tentative approaches toward Charlotte after Thomas's death and been politely but definitively discouraged, and who now found the sudden appearance of a romantic rival from the mountains irritating in principle. Charlotte was aware of all of this. She was always aware of everything that happened in her town. She dealt with it the way she dealt with most things, by being impeccably professional in public and allowing herself to feel what she felt in private, which lately included a great deal of warmth and a recurring awareness of how much better everything seemed when Harvey was nearby. 3 weeks into his stay, he asked her to take a Sunday ride with him, out to the edge of town where the hills started their slow roll northward. She put on her best riding skirt and her good brown boots and took her own horse, a sturdy roan mare she had owned for 6 years, and they rode out in the clear October light. The Flint Hills in autumn were something close to a religious experience. Charlotte had lived near them her whole adult life and still found them capable of taking her breath away. The way they moved in the wind, the way the light changed on the grass from gold to copper to deep russet depending on the hour, the way the sky above them was so enormous and so blue that it felt like an argument for something, though she could never have said precisely what. Harvey rode beside her and she could see, looking at him, that he was a different version of himself out here. The tension that he carried in town, the slight tightening around his eyes and the way he tracked movement with the reflexes of a man not quite comfortable being surrounded, that all dropped away out here. He breathed differently. He sat the gray horse with even more natural ease than usual. "You miss it," she said, not a question. "The quiet," he said. "Yes, not everything else." "What don't you miss?" He thought about it. "Being alone," he said. "I thought I wanted it. I thought I was built for it. And I'm a man who genuinely needs more solitude than most. But there's a difference between choosing quiet and choosing empty." He looked at her. "I chose empty for a long time and called it something else." Charlotte pulled her mare to a walk on the crest of a low hill, looking out north toward the high ground he had lived in. "Would you go back," she asked, "to the hills?" "The cabin's still standing," he said. "I checked on the way down. I didn't burn it behind me." He paused. "But I left with the intention of not going back to stay, whatever happens." "What do you intend to do then?" she asked. "You can't stay at the hotel forever." "No," he agreed. He had the hat in his hands again, turning it. She had noticed that he always had something in his hands when he was about to say something important. A cup, the hat, a piece of wood he'd pick up without thinking. "I was thinking about the old Marsh property," he said. "On the north end, you know it." She did. Ezra Marsh had died in the spring, leaving a farmstead with a solid house and decent land and no heirs who wanted any part of the Kansas territory. It had been sitting idle since April. "That's not cheap land," she said. "No," he said. "I have some money set aside. Trapping's not a glamorous living, but it's an honest one, and I spent almost nothing up there for 7 years. He looked at the hills. I could work it. Run some cattle eventually. Maybe help Pete with the livery some, if he'd have me." Charlotte looked at the profile of his face against the wide sky. She thought about the practicality of this, the way she always thought about practicality first, because it was how she had survived and built what she had built. She thought about a man who had come 7 years and several hundred feet of altitude down from a mountain because he had finally found the thing worth coming down for. She thought about herself at 34, with a business and a house behind the shop and a life that was full but that had a specific shaped gap in it, the size and shape of Harvey Bristol. "Harvey," she said. "Yes," he said, still looking at the hills. "Look at me." He did. Those gray eyes, the same ones she had carried in her memory for 7 years without quite admitting to herself why she kept them so carefully. "I'm not interested in doing this slowly," she said. "I'm 34 years old and I have been practical about important things for a very long time, and I am going to be direct with you now because I learned the cost of not being direct and I'm not willing to pay it again." His expression was intent and open. "I love you," she said. "I believe I have loved you for most of my adult life in one form or another, and I am very angry about the 7 years, and I intend to tell you so on a regular basis until I feel better about it, but I am not willing to pretend otherwise or make you work for something you've already earned just to prove a point." She paused. "So there it is." Harvey Bristol looked at her on that hilltop with the Flint Hills all around them and the October sky enormous overhead, and his face went through 3 or 4 things very quickly, and then he settled into something that was the purest form of happiness she had ever seen on a human face, the kind that is surprised by itself, the kind that has been waiting so long it almost doesn't recognize its own arrival. "Charlotte," he said. "Don't you dare cry," she said, "because I will absolutely also cry, and this is an outdoor situation." He laughed, and it came out slightly rough around the edges. "I love you," he said. "I've loved you so long I'm not sure there was a time I didn't." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, which was not a simple thing when both of you were on horseback, but he managed it with the careful deliberateness of a man who was determined to manage it. His hand was warm and certain and entirely right. "I'm not going anywhere again," he said. "I need you to believe that." "Prove it," she said, but she was squeezing his hand back, and they both knew she already believed him. He kissed her for the first time on that hill, leaning from his horse to hers in the awkward and beautiful way that people manage such things when they are determined enough, and it was brief and warm and tasted like coming home to a home you had built yourself, which is the very best kind. November came with its cold and its clarity, the air over the high plains turning sharp and blue. Harvey Bristol bought the Marsh property on a Thursday in early November, paying a fair price in cash from the savings he had accumulated in 7 years of trapping and careful living, and Pete Dunmore witnessed the transaction and shook his hand with considerable feeling afterward. The house on the Marsh property was solid, a 4-room structure of good Kansas limestone with a fireplace in the main room and a stove in the kitchen, and a porch that looked south toward the town and north toward the hills, which Harvey had said when he first walked through it was exactly what he needed, a house that faced both things at once. He worked on it through November. Charlotte came on Sundays, riding the roan mare out the north road with a basket of food that she pretended was surplus from her own cooking, and which she had actually prepared specifically for the purpose of feeding a man she was fairly certain would forget to feed himself if left to his own devices. They worked side by side on those Sundays, Charlotte painting the interior walls a clean cream color she had mixed herself from the mercantile stock, while Harvey repaired the roof and replaced the rotting boards on the porch. They talked the whole time. They had so much to say to each other after 7 years of unsaid things that silence became a luxury they spent rarely. She told him about Caldwell's growth, the railway and what it had changed, the people who had come and the people who had gone, the way the cattle drives were shifting now that there were more fences everywhere. He told her about the hills in detail, about the seasons up there and the wildlife and the particular quality of winter solitude, and also about the difficult things, the loneliness he had refused to name for years, the conversations he had with himself that had eventually become honest ones, the slow process of a man becoming accountable to his own interior. She told him about the bank refusing her loan without a cosigner, and about other things too, the way certain men in town had discounted her word or her judgment purely on the basis of her being a woman, the way she had learned to build around these obstacles rather than wait for them to be removed, because waiting had always seemed to her like something you did when you had nothing better to do. Harvey listened to all of this with a gathering and specific fury on her behalf that she found, to her own slight surprise, deeply satisfying. "You shouldn't have had to do it like that," he said, on one of those Sundays, when she had described the co-signing arrangement with Thomas in full. He said it not with pity, which would have irritated her, but with plain anger at the unfairness of the system. "No," she agreed. "I shouldn't have, but I did, and here we are, and I have the finest mercantile in Caldwell County, so there's that." "There's that," he said, with a kind of pride in his voice that she felt in her chest. They had dinner together most evenings that November. Sometimes at the hotel, sometimes at her house behind the mercantile, a neat two-room structure she had built gradually over the years, adding a parlor when the business got good enough to afford it, and a proper bedroom when she finally got around to wanting one. The house was hers in every detail, in the colors she'd chosen, and the curtains she'd made, and the books on the shelf, and the way the furniture sat just where she'd put it without anyone's opinion being required. Harvey fit into it carefully and with evident appreciation. He never moved anything without asking. He took off his boots at the door without being told, which Charlotte had always thought was an excellent indicator of character, a man who respected the spaces of others. He cooked sometimes, which surprised her, because she had not expected a mountain man to be a capable cook. But it turned out that 7 years of feeding yourself entirely through your own efforts produces a man who can do a great deal with limited ingredients, and his venison stew, made from a haunch he'd gotten from a trapper he knew north of town, was the finest thing she had eaten in recent memory. "You've been holding out on me," she said, eating it. "I've been holding out on a great many things," he said, and caught her eye across the table, and the look between them was warm enough to be felt across the room. December arrived with its first real snow, the kind that settled properly and stayed, and Caldwell shifted into its winter pace. The cattle drives were long over, the drovers gone south or east to winter quarters, and the town was left with its permanent residents and the quiet industry of cold weather. Charlotte kept the mercantile busy with winter goods, blankets and lamp oil and flour and dried beans, and all the provisions that turned a house into a sustainable place during the months when going out was an argument with the weather. Harvey, fully settled now at the Marsh property, which people had begun calling the Bristol place, divided his time between working the land, helping Pete at the livery when the old man needed it, and being present in Charlotte's life with the kind of steady, consistent presence that was, she had come to understand, his primary love language, if such a term had existed in 1883. He was not a man who spoke in elaborate declarations, the hilltop being the notable exception. He was a man who showed up, reliably and quietly, and did what needed doing, and looked at you across a room with an expression that left nothing whatsoever ambiguous. He had a conversation with Gerald Holt in December, the second week of it, that Charlotte heard about from Pete Dunmore, and then confirmed with Harvey himself, because she wanted to hear his version. Holt had apparently made some comment about Charlotte at the feed store, of the kind that implied she was making unwise choices in her personal life, specifically that a man who had been a mountain hermit for 7 years was not a sensible choice for a respectable widow. Harvey had heard this and said, in a very mild and quiet voice, that he was sure Holt meant well, but that Charlotte Redmond was the most capable judge of her own interests that he had ever encountered, and that anyone who felt the need to make judgments on her behalf was welcome to do so quietly and in a direction away from Harvey's ears. Charlotte, when Harvey told her this version, was briefly torn between being pleased and being irritated on principle that anyone thought her personal life required managing. She settled on being mostly pleased, with a note of the irritation retained for accuracy. "You didn't threaten him, did you?" she asked. "I expressed a preference," Harvey said mildly. "That's very political of you," she said. "I've had a lot of time to think about how to be measured," he said. The snow continued and the temperature dropped and Caldwell settled into the deep quiet of High Plains winter. Charlotte kept a fire going in the mercantile stove from opening to closing and still needed her heaviest shawl by afternoon. The mercantile was warm and smelled of pine resin from the holiday decorations, some of the women in town had gotten into the habit of making, a newer custom filtering in from the east, and Charlotte had put a pine bough above her door and some ribbon on the post, because it looked cheerful and she was feeling cheerful, which was a condition she had not taken for granted since it had returned. Harvey came in on the 22nd of December with something in his coat pocket that he was not subtle about being aware of. Charlotte was helping Mrs. Beauchamp, who had come in on the arm of her grandson for her monthly supply, and Harvey waited with characteristic patience near the fabric bolts. When Mrs. Beauchamp had been fully served and sent off with her grandson into the cold, and when the shop was empty of other customers, Harvey came to the counter. He put his hat down on the counter. He put his hand in his coat pocket. He took out a small item wrapped in a piece of cotton cloth. He set it on the counter between them. Charlotte looked at it. She looked at Harvey. His face was doing the complicated thing again, the transparent about feelings thing, and underneath the hope and the slight nervousness there was something so sincere and certain that it made her throat tight. "I am not a man who does things with much ceremony," he said. "You know that about me. I'm working on it, but it's probably going to remain substantially true." "I know that about you," she said. "I am also not a man who does things without thinking them through," he said. "Sometimes I think too long, but when I'm sure, I'm sure." "I know that too," she said. "I'm sure," he said. She unwrapped the cotton cloth. Inside was a ring, silver, set with a small dark blue stone that caught the light from the window and threw it back in pieces. It was not elaborate. It was exactly right, the kind of thing made by someone who knew the person they were making it for, and she would learn later that he had commissioned it from the silversmith in Dodge City on his way through in October, before he had even arrived in Caldwell, carrying it all this time with the specific kind of faith that is not arrogance but is its close and admirable neighbor. "Harvey Bristol," she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady, which she considered a personal victory. "Charlotte Redmond," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not a question in the conventional sense, meaning the inflection was not quite there, because Harvey was a man who had already reasoned through everything thoroughly and was stating the case rather than petitioning it, which was, Charlotte thought, the most him possible thing, and she loved him for it entirely. "Yes," she said. "Obviously. Don't make me say it dramatically." He smiled, slow and warm and entirely happy, and took her hand and put the ring on her finger and then held her hand with both of his big scarred warm ones. And Charlotte looked down at the ring, and the hands holding hers, and thought that she would remember this moment for the rest of her life, standing in her own mercantile with Flower no doubt still on her somewhere, and the winter light coming through the window, and everything finally exactly as it should be. She came around the counter. He put his arms around her, and she leaned into his chest, and he held her with the careful sureness of a man who understood the extraordinary value of what he was holding. They stood like that for a long time, and outside the snow continued its patient descent on the high plains, and inside the mercantile smelled of pine and warmth, and the ring on Charlotte's finger caught the light. They were married in January of 1884, on the 12th, which was a cold, bright day with the snow hard and glittering underfoot, and the sky an absolute and shameless blue. The ceremony was at the church on Birch Street, the same church Charlotte had attended since coming to Caldwell, and it was performed by Reverend Haskell, who had known Charlotte for 12 years and greeted Harvey with the cautiously approving air of a man who had been waiting to see what sort of person Charlotte would eventually choose and was finding himself satisfied with the answer. The whole town came, or as near as made no difference. Pete Dunmore sat in the front row and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand at the moment. Charlotte walked up the aisle in the dress she had made herself, deep cream wool with navy trim, her dark hair up under a simple hat with a single ribbon, carrying pine branches and dried winter berries because that was what was available, and it suited her better anyway. Old Mrs. Beauchamp sat beside Pete and patted his arm. Harvey stood at the front of the church in a suit that he had purchased in Dodge City on a brief trip. He had made in late December specifically for this purpose, dark charcoal with a white shirt, and a carefully knotted tie that he had practiced with in the hotel mirror for an embarrassing amount of time. He was clean-shaven, which he had also committed to for the occasion, and the result was that he looked younger than he had when he arrived, or perhaps it was just that he looked settled and certain in a way that made him seem more fully himself than the bearded mountain version had. When Charlotte came up the aisle, he watched her all the way, and the expression on his face was one that Reverend Haskell later described to his wife as the most straightforwardly loving thing he had ever seen on a man's face, and he had been performing weddings for 22 years. Charlotte reached him. He took her hand. "You look beautiful," he said quietly just for her. "You're clean-shaven," she said just for him. "I was making an effort," he said. "I noticed," she said, and they were both fighting smiles as Reverend Haskell cleared his throat with the gentle authority of a man used to managing the emotional momentum of wedding ceremonies. The vows were said in full. Harvey's voice was low and steady and did not waver, which Charlotte had told herself she would remain dry-eyed about and did not quite manage. She said her own vows clearly, because Charlotte Redmond had always meant what she said and wanted everyone in the room to know it. At the moment when they were told they could seal the ceremony with a kiss, Harvey cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness that was remarkable in a man of his size and nature, and kissed her softly and thoroughly, and the assembled Caldwell congregation clapped with genuine enthusiasm, Pete Dunmore loudest of all. The reception was held at the hotel's dining room, pushed into its largest configuration with tables along all the walls and a fiddle player in the corner who was, mercifully, better tuned than the one Charlotte had heard in November. There was food enough for everyone and then some, because half the women in town had contributed to it, which was the custom of the place and time. There was dancing, which Harvey engaged in with the determined focus of a man who did not dance naturally, but was committed to learning in real time, and Charlotte taught him with her hand in his and the sound of the fiddle, and the whole room warm around them. "You're doing well," she told him, after a turn that had gone better than the previous ones. "I have strong motivation," he said. She laughed and leaned into him, and the fiddle played on. They went home that night to the Bristol place, which Charlotte had helped furnish over the previous weeks with a combination of her own things and new things, and the particular satisfaction of making a shared space together. The house was warm, the fire laid and kept going by Pete Dunmore, who had a key and had been there earlier. There were candles on the table, also Pete, who was apparently a more romantic soul than anyone had fully appreciated. Charlotte stood in the main room of the house that was now hers as much as Harvey's, and looked at the firelight on the limestone walls, and felt the particular quality of happiness that comes not from everything being perfect, but from everything being genuinely right. Harvey stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, because she fit exactly there and she had known it for a long time. "Harvey," she said. He said, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I'm glad you came down the mountain." He turned her gently around and looked at her with the firelight on his face and his gray eyes full of everything he felt for her. "So am I," he said. "Charlotte," he said her name the way some people said prayer, with the weight of everything they meant by it underneath. "I am going to spend the rest of my life being glad." She put her hands on either side of his face and pulled him down to her level, which required some cooperative effort on his part, and kissed him with everything she had, all the waiting and the wondering and the years apart and the joy of the present moment, all of it together, and he kissed her back just as fully, and the fire crackled and the candles burned, and the Kansas night was cold and clear and full of stars outside the window. The winter settled in around them properly after that, the deep settled kind that turns a house into a world of its own. Charlotte kept the mercantile running 6 days a week with her usual efficiency, and on the 7th day she was at home or riding out to the hills with Harvey or both, the mornings at the Bristol place becoming the most looked forward to hours of her week. Harvey had the cattle operation in its earliest stages, 2 yearling steers purchased from a rancher south of town, a beginning that he approached with the systematic patience he applied to most things. He had also taken on the livery work with Pete officially now, 2 mornings a week, and Pete had responded to this arrangement by looking 10 years younger and laughing more frequently. Spring came to the high plains with its usual combination of beauty and violence, warm days interrupted by late storms that blew in off the prairie with no warning worth trusting. April brought one such storm, a blizzard that came down from the north in the middle of a warm spell, catching everyone off guard. Charlotte and Harvey rode it out at the Bristol place, snowed in for 3 days, which they spent reading aloud to each other from the books she had brought from the mercantile, playing cards, cooking elaborate meals from what was in the larder, and talking in the way that people talk when they have all the time in the world and the world outside the window is white and silent. On the second day of the blizzard, Harvey said, quietly, while they were doing dishes together after supper, "Do you want children?" Charlotte had been expecting this question for a while and had been thinking about her answer. "I would like them," she said. "I'm 34, which is not as young as it might be, but it's not as old as it might be either." "No," he said. "What do you want?" she asked. He dried a plate carefully the way he did everything. "I want whatever makes you happy," he said. "But yes, I would like children if they come. I think I would be a decent father. I'm not sure I was built to be an excellent one, but I'm willing to try hard, which I think amounts to the same thing over time." Charlotte took the dried plate from him. "It does," she said. He looked at her. "Then we're in agreement." "We're in agreement," she said. By summer they knew that agreement had produced results. Charlotte was, as the doctor confirmed in June of 1884, expecting a child. The news came with the particular quality of settled joy that characterizes important things arriving right on time rather than before you were ready. She was a woman of practical temperament and physical health and strong constitution, and she approached the pregnancy the way she approached most of life's major events, with thorough preparation and the firm intention of handling it well. Harvey responded to the news with a silence that lasted about 30 seconds, and then broke into the widest and most unguarded smile Charlotte had ever seen on his face. He sat down heavily in the chair nearest him, not because he was distressed, but because his knees had apparently decided this was important enough to register. "Sit down," Charlotte told him unnecessarily since he already had. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is typically what this indicates." "Our child," he said, as if clarifying the concept for himself. "Unless there's something remarkable you'd like to tell me," she said. He stood up again and came to her, and held her face in his hands again. The gesture she had come to understand was his most instinctive expression of the feelings he couldn't always get into words, and looked at her with those gray eyes absolutely full. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't do it alone," she pointed out. "No," he said, but he shook his head slightly, unable to find the rest of it. She put her hands over his. "I know," she said. She kept the mercantile running through the pregnancy because she had always run the mercantile and she saw no reason to stop. She hired a young woman, Clara Bright, 17 years old and the eldest daughter of one of the farming families north of town, to help with the heavier lifting and the longer hours. And Clara turned out to be a quick learner with a good head for numbers, which Charlotte recognized and cultivated with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been denied the ability to develop her own skills by systems that assumed they weren't there. Harvey, meanwhile, had expanded the cattle operation to 8 head and built a proper fence line on the eastern edge of the property, and was in the process of building a second room onto the house, which he did in the careful, methodical way he did all things, measuring twice and cutting once and checking his work from multiple angles. Charlotte came out on Sundays and told him what she thought about the room's dimensions and the placement of the window, and Harvey listened carefully and adjusted accordingly, because he was a man who genuinely valued her opinion, and also because he had learned very early in their marriage that Charlotte's spatial instincts were better than his. September of 1884 brought the harvest and the beginning of Charlotte's final trimester, and a letter from Harvey's sister in Ohio, a woman named Ruth, who had been writing to Harvey at the hotel address since she heard through the family grapevine that he had come down from the hills. Ruth's letters were warm and somewhat reproachful about the 7 years, and enthusiastic about the marriage, and extremely curious about Charlotte. Charlotte wrote back herself, a long letter that Ruth apparently shared with their mother, which produced a second letter from Ruth saying their mother had cried in the best possible way. Harvey read his sister's letters slowly and carefully, and wrote back in the deliberate way he had, 3 or 4 paragraphs of substantial content rather than lengthy meandering, and Charlotte could see in his face after these exchanges that the rebuilding of that connection was something that mattered to him in ways he hadn't quite let himself acknowledge before. "You should invite her," Charlotte said one evening, when he had put Ruth's latest letter down with a particular expression. "It's a long way from Ohio," he said. "People travel," Charlotte said. "The railway makes it considerably more manageable than it was." He considered this. "You'd want that. She's a lot, Ruth." "She talks a great deal." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "I run a mercantile. I talk to the entirety of Caldwell 6 days a week. I think I can handle your sister." He smiled. "Fair." The letter went out and Ruth wrote back saying she would come in the spring, which was both practical, given the winter travel, and something that Harvey noted with quiet pleasure. The child was born on the 4th of November, 1884. Which was a Tuesday morning with frost on the windows and Pete Dunmore pacing the porch of the Bristol place in a state of high agitation while the midwife, a competent and unflappable woman named Mrs. Garrity, did her work inside. Harvey stayed with Charlotte through all of it, because Charlotte had told him she wanted him there, and because he could not have been in another room if you had tried to drag him, and Mrs. Garrity, after the briefest professional assessment of the man, had decided he was the steady type and allowed it. The child was a boy. He arrived into the world with considerable voice and no hesitation about using it, which Charlotte later said was the most characteristic thing about him from the very beginning. He had Harvey's gray eyes and Charlotte's dark hair, and the general energetic quality of someone with things to do. They named him Thomas James Bristol. Thomas for Charlotte's first husband, who had been a decent man who deserved the acknowledgement, and James for Harvey's father, who had died when Harvey was 20, and whom Harvey did not speak of often but thought of regularly. Charlotte had suggested Thomas first, and Harvey had looked at her for a long moment, and then said that was exactly right, because it was, and because Harvey Bristol had always been better than most at recognizing when something was exactly right. Pete Dunmore, when he was allowed inside to meet Thomas James, sat down in the rocking chair near the fire with the baby in his enormous hands and went completely quiet for 2 minutes, which was unprecedented for Pete, and then said, "Well now," in a voice that required clearing twice. The winter of 1884 going into 1885 was the best winter Charlotte had ever lived, which she said to Harvey in February when he asked how she was doing, and he looked at her holding Thomas James while the fire burned and the snow fell outside their limestone house, and he said simply, "Same." Thomas James Bristol was a robust and loud and thoroughly engaging infant. He slept in the second room Harvey had built, which had turned out to have excellent light and just the right dimensions because Charlotte had been right about both things. He woke frequently and had opinions about most of the times he was put down, and Harvey, to Charlotte's considerable and genuine surprise, turned out to be remarkable with him. He would walk Thomas James in the early mornings, long before Charlotte needed to be up, making slow circuits of the main room with the baby against his chest. And Thomas James, who was loud about most things, went quiet against his father's heartbeat with the reliability of a scientific law. Charlotte would wake sometimes to find Harvey's side of the bed empty and hear them in the main room, the creak of his boots on the floorboards and occasionally the low sound of Harvey's voice telling Thomas James about something, the weather, the cattle, the the names of the hills to the north, things that the infant could not comprehend and seemed to find deeply satisfying as sound. "What are you telling him?" Charlotte asked one morning when Harvey came back to bed at first light and Thomas James had gone back to sleep. "About the stars," Harvey said. "What I know about navigation by them, whether or not he understands currently seems beside the point." "It does," she agreed. And she curled toward him and went back to sleep with her head against his shoulder, and Thomas James slept in the next room, and the stars Harvey had been describing were still there outside the window, doing their ancient patient work. Ruth Bristol arrived in April of 1885 on the train from Ohio by way of St. Louis and Dodge City. She was 32 years old, slender and energetic and possessed of the same gray eyes as Harvey, but with an entirely different deployment of them. Where Harvey's were still and attentive, Ruth's were quick and dancing and missed very little. She talked, as Harvey had warned, a great deal, but with the substance and warmth behind it that made a great deal of talk entirely welcome. Charlotte liked her within 4 minutes of meeting her at the station platform, which was approximately the time it took Ruth to look at Charlotte with those observant gray eyes and say, "You're exactly what I hoped he'd find." Ruth stayed for 6 weeks, and they were 6 of the liveliest weeks Caldwell had seen in a while. She was delighted by Thomas James, who returned the sentiment by performing his best and most dramatic versions of all his tricks for her. She was interested in the mercantile in the way that a capable woman is always interested in another capable woman's operation, asking intelligent questions and making a few suggestions that Charlotte actually found worth considering. She walked the hills with Harvey in the mornings, and those walks, Charlotte gathered from what Harvey said afterward, covered a great deal of the 7 years of separated sibling ground in ways that mattered to both of them. On her second-to-last evening, Ruth sat with Charlotte on the porch of the Bristol place while Harvey was putting Thomas James down in the other room, the baby having declared it an evening for considerable theatrical protest about sleeping. "He's different," Ruth said. "Better. Himself in a way he wasn't before he went up there, and more so since coming back down." "I know," Charlotte said. "He was never meant to be alone," Ruth said. "I knew that even when he seemed to want it. He's built for being with people he loves. He just doesn't love many, which makes the ones he does love important." Charlotte watched the last light going off the hills to the north, the deep rose and amber of a clear April evening. "He loves you very much," she said. "He doesn't say so in great quantity, but it's apparent." "He loves you in great quantity and also apparency," Ruth said. "I've been watching all week. It's rather wonderful to see, if you want my honest opinion." "I always want honest opinions," Charlotte said. "I could tell that about you," Ruth said. "It's part of why you're exactly right for him." When Ruth left on the morning train, Harvey stood on the platform and watched the train out of sight with the kind of stillness that Charlotte by now understood was not absence but the opposite, a man fully present to something. She stood beside him and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and Thomas James, on Charlotte's other hip, watched the departed train with the wide eyes of a person for whom trains were still among the most astonishing things in existence. The summer of 1885 brought growth in all directions. Charlotte expanded the mercantile, adding a back room that she had long been wanting for proper storage, and which now freed up the front of the shop for better display. Clara Bright had developed into such a capable assistant that Charlotte had given her a small partnership share in the business, a decision that Clara had responded to with the look of a person who had been given something they had hoped for but not quite dared to expect. Charlotte knew that look. She intended Clara Bright to have every advantage she had not had herself, insofar as it was in her power to provide it. Harvey's cattle operation had grown to 30 head by August, which was modest but honest, and showed the careful increment of a man who expanded only as fast as he could do right by what he had. He had also, in a development that surprised him more than anyone, begun doing some work for the county on their road improvement project, surveying and clearing the northern routes toward the Flint Hills. He knew that terrain better than anyone alive, and the county engineer who came up from Wichita in June took one look at Harvey's knowledge of the hills and offered him a consulting role that Harvey accepted with the proviso that he could do most of it from the back of the gray horse and didn't need to come to Wichita. The county engineer said he could likely manage that, and so it was arranged, and Harvey spent 3 mornings a week through the late summer writing surveys he could do in his sleep, and producing maps and assessments that the county found invaluable, and he came home those evenings dusty and sun-warm and satisfied in the way of work that uses you well. Charlotte watched all of this with the pleasure of seeing a person become what they are meant to be. Harvey Bristol had thought of himself as a man apart, a man meant for solitude and wilderness and the turning of his own inner world. What he was actually, she had come to understand, was a man of extraordinary depth and capability who had needed the mountain years to find the ground of himself, and who, now that he had found it, could bring all of it back to a life lived with and for other people. He was a better partner because of those 7 years. She would not have chosen to have been without him for them, but she could see their value in the finished product. November brought Thomas James's first birthday, which they celebrated with the particular enthusiasm of parents for whom a first birthday is genuinely wondrous. Pete Dunmore came, and Mrs. Beauchamp's grandson brought her in a wagon because she was 92 now and moving was an enterprise. Clara Bright came with her mother and 2 of her siblings. Reverend Haskell came. Various neighbors and friends filled the Bristol place with warm noise and candlelight and the smell of Charlotte's cooking, which was considerable, and Thomas James sat at the center of it all like a small king of considerable opinion, delighted by the attention and the sugar cake and the general festivity. Harvey stood at the edge of the room at one point, and Charlotte found him there, looking at the gathered people in his house, at the firelight and the noise and the life that had accumulated in this limestone building on the north edge of Caldwell, Kansas. "You all right?" she asked. "More than," he said. He looked at Thomas James, who was presently being held by Pete and was attempting to eat Pete's watch chain with the concentration of a scholar. He looked at Charlotte. "I was thinking about the mountain," he said. "Good thoughts or bad?" "Good," he said. "It was what I needed it to be, but this—" he gestured, a small and somewhat helpless motion that took in the room and everything in it. "This is what I didn't know how to need until I didn't have it." She took his hand. He held hers with both of his the way he always did, the warm and certain and entirely right feeling of it. "It's yours," she said. "It's ours." "Yes," he said. He looked at the room again, at the people he had come back for and the ones he had found once he returned and the life that had assembled itself from the decision to finally come down. "Yes, it is." The winter of 1885 going into 1886 was a harder one, colder than the previous 2, with storms that lasted longer and the kind of deep freeze that tested livestock and structures, and the people who depended on both. Harvey managed it with the competence of a man who had survived 7 Kansas winters alone in a cabin with less than he had now, and the Bristol place came through in good order. The cattle wintered with hay he had cut and stored through the autumn, the house warm from the fireplace and the kitchen stove. Charlotte ran the mercantile through it all, because the mercantile was more essential in hard winters than easy ones, and she and Clara kept it stocked and open and warm, and provided a kind of community anchor that she was quietly proud of. She extended credit to 2 families that winter who were struggling, quietly and without making it a public matter, because she had learned from her own early years the dignity cost of needing help, and how it was easier to accept when the person offering it didn't make a ceremony of it. Harvey knew she had done this. She hadn't told him, but he'd seen the account books, which he helped her with occasionally. He said nothing about it, only, one evening when she was closing the books, put a hand on her shoulder briefly as he passed. She understood the fullness of what that meant, which was the thing about learning a person properly over time, how their silences and gestures come to carry as much as their words. Spring of 1886 was sweet after the hard winter. the green coming back to the hills with the particular intensity that follows a severe cold, everything pushing up hard and bright and determined. Charlotte knew by March that Thomas James was going to be a brother. She told Harvey on a Sunday morning when he came in from his early barn rounds, standing at the kitchen stove making coffee, turning when she heard his boots at the door. "I'm going to need you to build another room," she said. Harvey looked at her. He looked at her stomach, which was very early yet and showed nothing at all. He looked at her face. "Charlotte," he said. "Don't sit down this time," she said. "You're better on your feet." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and picked her up, which was not something he did often because Charlotte was not generally available to be picked up and had opinions about it. But this once she allowed it, and he held her up against his chest with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and she felt him breathing. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "When? October, Mrs. Garrity thinks." He set her down carefully. He held her face in his hands. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, as if she was the most significant thing in the known world, which she had finally stopped finding embarrassing and started accepting as simply what it was. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am," she agreed, with a smile she couldn't keep small. "Now have some coffee and go figure out where you're putting the new room." He laughed, the low, surprised, genuine laugh she loved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The new room went up through the summer, on the south side of the house this time, with a window that would catch the afternoon light, which Harvey had figured out was Charlotte's preference after watching where she sat when she had a choice. Thomas James, now a walking and increasingly vocal 1.5-year-old, provided enthusiastic supervision from a safe distance, having developed a strong interest in hammers that required careful management. The baby was born in October as Mrs. Garrity had predicted, a girl this time, arriving with a great deal of dark hair and the particular quality of alertness that suggested she was already taking inventory of everything around her. They named her Ruth Eleanor Bristol. Ruth for Harvey's sister, who received this news in a letter and wrote back 6 pages of the most emotionally expansive prose Charlotte had ever read, which she read aloud to Harvey at the kitchen table, and which made them both laugh and feel warm simultaneously. Eleanor for Charlotte's mother, who had died when Charlotte was 16, and whom she carried as a continuous presence in the way that lost mothers tend to be carried. Thomas James, shown his sister, reached out and patted her head with the careful fascination of a child who has been told this is a sibling, and is still working out what that means practically. Ruth Eleanor looked at him with her new dark eyes, and he looked back at her with his gray ones, and something was established in that first look that would persist, Charlotte thought, for the rest of their lives. Pete Dunmore came to meet Ruth Eleanor and sat with her in the rocking chair, this time with considerably more ease, as a man who has already held one such creature and knows the procedure. He talked to her in a low rumble about the livery and the gray horse and the general state of things, and Ruth Eleanor listened with the focused intensity of a person taking it all in for future use. "That horse of Harvey's is going to need a companion soon," Pete told her seriously. "Man with a family needs 2 horses at least." "He has 4 now," Charlotte said from across the room. Pete looked up. "When that happen?" "Gradually," Charlotte said, in the way that most of Harvey's expansions happened. "The years settled into themselves after that, the way years do when the major battles have been won, and what remains is the rich daily work of a life built well and lived accordingly." Charlotte Redmond Bristol, as she was now, and as she thought of herself with a warmth that never quite became ordinary, ran the finest mercantile in Caldwell County with Clara Bright as her partner and half a dozen good habits as her system. She knew most of the county by name, and they knew her, and the respect in which she was held was the earned kind, the kind that takes time and cannot be purchased or inherited. Harvey Bristol ran his cattle and his surveys, and his 2 mornings a week at the livery, and built or fixed or maintained whatever needed building or fixing or maintaining with the quiet systematic competence that was as much his nature as the gray eyes. He was a man who had found his right place after a considerable detour, and he inhabited it with the settled sureness of someone who knows what they have and why it matters. Thomas James grew into a boy of 7 by 1891, all Bristol height and Redmond determination, with his father's gift for stillness and his mother's gift for words. He had already begun spending mornings at the livery with Pete Dunmore in the summers, because Pete, at 93, could now do very little of the physical work himself. But his judgment was sound, and his stories were good, and Thomas James was an excellent audience who was also learning to reshoe a horse. Ruth Eleanor, at 4, was a small and formidably observant person who had already demonstrated that she had inherited both her mother's business sense and her father's capacity for deep attention, a combination that Charlotte looked at sometimes and thought the world had better be ready. There was a moment, in the spring of 1891, that stayed with Charlotte afterward as one of those moments that contains everything. She was standing in the front window of the mercantile, the same window she had stood in on the day Harvey came back, and she was looking up the north road toward the hills. It was early morning, the light still coming in low and golden, and the Flint Hills were that particular shade of new green that only existed for about 3 weeks in April, and was worth whatever you had to do to be there to see it. Harvey came up the main street on the gray horse's successor, a pale horse he had named simply Horse with the minimalist labeling tendency she had long accepted about him. He had been out on a county survey since before dawn, which was typical, and he was coming back with the easy seat and the settled look of a man returning to where he wanted to be. He saw her in the window and lifted a hand, unhurried, and she lifted one back. He stopped at the livery, which was habit, and then he would come to the mercantile, which was also habit, and she would have coffee made because she always had coffee made at this hour, and he would lean his elbows on her counter and they would talk for 20 minutes before the day got properly underway, because this was the rhythm of them, the daily bread of it, the ordinary miracle. She thought of the day he had first walked back into this town, 7 years away, carved into his face, and a specific purpose in his eyes that she had recognized and been afraid to believe. She thought of the hilltop and the ring and the winter fire and Thomas James against his father's heartbeat in the dark of the morning, and Ruth Eleanor's first inventory-taking gaze. She thought of Ruth Bristol's voice and Pete Dunmore's hands and old Mrs. Beauchamp, who had died the previous winter at 93 with the happy acuity of a woman who had seen a great deal and been satisfied with the final accounting. She thought about the bank that had refused her loan. She thought about the 7 years Harvey had spent learning to be honest with himself so that he could finally be honest with her. She thought about Thomas Redmond, who had been a decent man and deserved to be remembered as one. She thought about all of it, the whole accumulated weight of it, and it felt not heavy but rich, full of the specific gravity of things that have been lived genuinely. The mercantile door opened and Harvey came in, hat in hand, mountain mud on his boots as it seemed there always would be, the mark of a man who kept one foot in the wild country no matter how fully he lived in the human one. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She turned from the window. She looked at him across the room she had built and tended and loved. "Coffee's ready." He came to the counter and leaned his elbows on it, and she poured 2 cups and set his in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around it and looked at her with those gray eyes that were the same eyes she had seen across the main street of Caldwell on an autumn day in 1883 and recognized with her whole self before she could articulate why. "Good survey," he said. "Found a better route north, saves about 2 miles. "You can tell me all about it," she said. "I know," he said. And he smiled at her over the rim of the cup. Outside, Caldwell went on being Caldwell, busy with its railway and its commerce and its livestock and its daily human negotiations. The Flint Hills stood to the north as they had always stood and always would, enormous and patient and full of the particular wisdom of wild places. Somewhere in the hills, an old cabin stood empty, its door weathered and its chimney cold, a place that had done its work and served its purpose. And in the mercantile on the main street, Charlotte Redmond Bristol and Harvey Bristol drank their morning coffee and talked about roots and cattle and the children, and what they might have for Sunday supper. And the sun came through the window at the same angle it always had, and everything was exactly as it should be. Ruth Eleanor Bristol grew up to be, as her mother had suspected, a person the world needed to be prepared for. She was studying at the first proper school for women that had established itself in Kansas by the time she was 16, and she had already told her father, calmly and entirely seriously, that she intended to own a business, which Harvey had received without surprise and with complete confidence in her ability to do exactly that. He had told her so, and she had nodded as if this was the correct response, because she had always known it would be, and she was her mother's daughter. Thomas James came back from a summer in the hills at 17, having gone with his father's blessing and explicit advice about what was worth the time and what was not, and returned with the same settled quality Harvey had found up there, a young man who had spent time alone with himself and come back knowing himself better for it. Harvey had said nothing much when he returned, just looked at him for a long moment and nodded once, and Thomas James had understood everything in that nod. Charlotte saw this exchange from across the yard and felt something she could only describe as the completeness of things. Harvey caught her watching and came to her, and she took his arm, and they stood in the autumn light in the yard of the Bristol place with the house behind them and the hills to the north, and the town spread out below. "All right?" he asked, as he always asked when he found her in a moment of stillness. "More than," she said, borrowing his word from long ago, from the night of Thomas James's birthday, from the moment when he had finally known the size of what they had built. He put his arm around her. She leaned into the solid, familiar warmth of him. The sky above the Flint Hills was the deep blue of a clear Kansas afternoon, the kind of blue that goes all the way to the bottom. They stood like that for a long time, the way they always had when the world was being particularly itself, and words seemed beside the point. The mountain man who had come down from the hills and the woman who had been the reason, standing together in the life they had made from the accumulated courage of finally saying what they meant. And it was good, and it was real, and it was entirely and completely theirs.